In the early years of the 20th century, when most people believed that science was only for men, a little girl in England was about to prove everyone wrong. Her name was Dorothy Crowfoot, and her story would change the world of medicine forever. Dorothy was born in 1910 in Cairo, Egypt, where her father worked as an archaeologist and scholar. Her parents were not ordinary people. They believed in education and curiosity regardless of whether you were a boy or a girl. This unusual thinking for that time would shape Dorothy's entire life. When Dorothy was just 4 years old, something magical happened. Her mother showed her some beautiful colored crystals. These weren't expensive jewels or fancy decorations. They were simple copper sulfate crystals that her mother had grown at home. Dorothy held these blue crystals in her small hands and was completely mesmerized. The way light passed through them, the perfect geometric shapes, the deep blue color, everything about them fascinated her young mind. Most children would have forgotten about these crystals after a few days. But not Dorothy. She couldn't stop thinking about them. How did they form? Why were they shaped so perfectly? What made them blue? These questions filled her curious mind day and night. Her parents encouraged this curiosity. They gave her books about chemistry and minerals. They helped her conduct simple experiments at home. While other girls her age were playing with dolls, Dorothy was growing crystals in her bedroom. She was mixing chemicals and observing reactions. She was keeping detailed notebooks about everything she discovered. Life wasn't always easy for young Dorothy. Because her parents worked in Egypt and other distant places, she had to spend long periods away from them. She lived with family friends in England and attended boarding schools. These separations were painful for a young girl who loved her parents deeply. But Dorothy used this time to dive even deeper into her studies. At school, Dorothy faced a harsh reality. In the 1920s, most schools didn't teach science to girls. The common belief was that girls should learn cooking, sewing, and how to manage a household. Science and mathematics were considered too difficult for the female brain, a ridiculous idea that society accepted as truth. But Dorothy's school had one chemistry teacher who thought differently. This teacher noticed Dorothy's exceptional talent and burning curiosity. Against all the normal rules and expectations, this teacher allowed Dorothy to join the boys' chemistry classes. Dorothy was often the only girl in the room, surrounded by boys who sometimes made fun of her presence. Did this stop Dorothy? Not at all. She worked harder than anyone else. She asked more questions. She stayed late in the laboratory. She read every chemistry book she could find. Her dedication was so intense that even the boys who initially mocked her began to respect her knowledge and skills. When Dorothy was 16, she read about something that changed her life forever. She learned about X-ray crystallography, a new technique that scientists had just developed. This method used X-rays to see the arrangement of atoms inside crystals. It was like having a magical microscope that could see things millions of times smaller than what the human eye could see. Dorothy realized something profound. If scientists could see the atomic structure of simple crystals, why couldn't they see the structure of important biological molecules? What about proteins that keep us alive? What about vitamins? What about the medicines that cure diseases? If we could see how these molecules were built, atom by atom, we could understand how they worked. And if we understood how they worked, we could create better medicines and save more lives. This idea became Dorothy's obsession. She decided right then that she would dedicate her life to seeing the invisible world of molecules. She would use X-ray crystallography to reveal the secrets that nature had hidden at the atomic level. But there was a huge problem. Dorothy wanted to attend Oxford University, one of the best universities in the world. Oxford did accept women students, but only in very limited numbers. The competition was incredibly fierce, and for science subjects it was even more difficult because most people still believed women couldn't handle advanced scientific work. Dorothy prepared herself like never before. She studied chemistry, physics, and mathematics with complete dedication. She spent countless hours solving problems and conducting experiments. Her goal was not just to get into Oxford. She wanted to prove that a woman could excel in science just as well as any man. When the time came for her entrance examination, Dorothy was nervous but prepared. She walked into the examination hall with her head held high. She answered every question with confidence and precision. She showed the examiners that she didn't just memorize facts, she truly understood the deep concepts of chemistry. The wait for results felt like forever. Every day, Dorothy checked the mail with trembling hands. Had she done enough? Would Oxford accept her? Would they give a girl from a modest background a chance to pursue her scientific dreams? Finally, the letter arrived. Dorothy opened it with shaking hands. As she read the words, tears filled her eyes. She had been accepted. Oxford University had opened its doors to her. She was going to study chemistry at one of the world's greatest institutions. Her parents were proud beyond words. Her teachers celebrated her achievement. But Dorothy knew this was just the beginning. Getting into Oxford was one victory, but the real challenge lay ahead. She would have to prove herself every single day in a world that didn't believe women belonged in science laboratories. In 1928, at the age of 18, Dorothy arrived at Oxford. She carried her small suitcase and her big dreams. She walked through the ancient gates of Somerville College, the women's college at Oxford. The beautiful old buildings, the libraries filled with books, the laboratories equipped with modern instruments, everything excited her. But Dorothy also noticed something that made her uncomfortable. Even at Oxford, women students were treated differently. They had separate dining halls. They couldn't use certain libraries. They weren't allowed in some parts of the university. Male professors often dismissed their questions or doubted their abilities. Dorothy decided to ignore these obstacles. She focused completely on her studies. She spent hours in the chemistry laboratory, conducting experiments and learning new techniques. She attended every lecture, took detailed notes, and asked challenging questions that made her professors think deeply. And then, one day during her second year at Oxford, Dorothy walked into a particular laboratory. There, she saw an X-ray crystallography apparatus for the first time in real life. The machine looked complicated and mysterious. But to Dorothy, it looked like a door to a hidden world. She approached the machine slowly, almost reverently. This was the tool that would allow her to see what no human eye could see, the atomic architecture of molecules. This was the beginning of her real journey. A journey that would take decades of patient work. A journey that would test her dedication, her health, and her spirit. A journey that would eventually change medicine and save millions of lives. Dorothy stood there in that laboratory, looking at the X-ray crystallography machine, and made a silent promise to herself. She would master this technique. She would use it to reveal nature's deepest secrets. And she would prove that patience, curiosity, and dedication matter more than gender. Little did she know that this promise would lead her to spend 35 years solving one of science's greatest puzzles. But that story was still ahead of her, waiting to unfold one patient day at a time. After finishing her studies at Oxford, Dorothy moved to Cambridge University to continue her research. She was now in her early 20s, full of energy and ambition. The year was 1932, and the world of science was buzzing with new discoveries. Dorothy worked in one of the most advanced X-ray crystallography laboratories in the world, learning from the best scientists of her time. But Dorothy wasn't satisfied with just learning. She wanted to tackle something big, something meaningful, something that would make a real difference in people's lives. She spent her evenings reading medical journals and talking to doctors. She wanted to understand which diseases caused the most suffering and which molecules scientists knew the least about. One evening, while reading a medical journal, Dorothy came across an article about diabetes. She learned that millions of people around the world suffered from this disease. Their bodies couldn't process sugar properly, and without treatment they would die. But there was hope. A substance called insulin, discovered just a decade earlier in 1921, could keep diabetic patients alive. The problem was that nobody understood how insulin actually worked. Scientists knew it was a protein, a large molecule made up of hundreds of atoms connected together. They knew it helped the body process sugar, but they had no idea what insulin looked like at the atomic level. They couldn't see its shape, its structure, or how it did its job. Dorothy read that article over and over again. Her mind raced with possibilities. If she could determine the structure of insulin, if she could see exactly how its atoms were arranged, scientists could understand how it worked. And if they understood how it worked, they could make better versions of it. They could help millions of diabetic patients live better lives. The next day, Dorothy announced her decision to her colleagues. She was going to determine the structure of insulin. She was going to use X-ray crystallography to see what this life-saving molecule looked like at the atomic level. The reaction was not what she expected. Her fellow scientists looked at her with a mixture of concern and disbelief. One senior researcher shook his head and said, "Dorothy, that's impossible. Insulin is far too complex. It has hundreds of atoms. The calculations alone would take decades." Another colleague added, "Even if you somehow got good X-ray photographs, you'd never be able to interpret them. The mathematics is too difficult. No one has ever solved the structure of anything this complicated." But the most discouraging comment came from a professor she deeply respected. He looked at her kindly and said, "Dorothy, you're a brilliant scientist. Don't waste your career chasing an impossible dream. Choose something smaller, something achievable. You could have a wonderful career studying simpler molecules." Dorothy listened to all these warnings. She understood their concerns. They weren't trying to discourage her out of meanness. They genuinely believed insulin was too difficult, too complex, too ambitious for any scientist to solve, especially a young woman just starting her career. But something inside Dorothy refused to give up. She thought about all those diabetic patients who needed better treatment. She thought about the children who had to inject insulin every day just to stay alive. She thought about the families watching their loved ones suffer. If there was even a small chance she could help them, wasn't it worth trying? In 1934, Dorothy returned to Oxford as a research fellow. She set up her own laboratory and began her work on insulin. She obtained pure insulin crystals from pharmaceutical companies. These crystals were tiny, barely visible to the naked eye, but they held the secret she was searching for. The process of X-ray crystallography was incredibly tedious. Dorothy had to place each tiny insulin crystal in front of an X-ray beam. The X-rays would pass through the crystal, and the way they scattered would create a pattern on photographic film. This pattern contained information about where every atom in the molecule was located. But here was the catch. One photograph wasn't enough. Dorothy needed thousands of photographs taken from different angles. Each photograph required hours of precise work. The crystals had to be positioned exactly right. The exposure time had to be perfect. Even a small mistake meant starting over. Dorothy worked day and night. She took photograph after photograph. Her laboratory was filled with the smell of developing chemicals and the dim glow of safety lights. She worked alone for long hours, adjusting equipment, developing films, and recording data in her notebooks. Then, something happened that would test Dorothy's determination like never before. She began experiencing pain in her hands. At first, it was just stiffness in the mornings. She ignored it and continued her work. But the pain grew worse. Her fingers began to swell. Some mornings, she couldn't even hold a pen properly. Dorothy visited a doctor, hoping it was just exhaustion from overwork. The diagnosis hit her like a physical blow. Rheumatoid arthritis, a disease that causes severe inflammation and pain in the joints. The doctor looked at her hands and then at her face with sympathy. He knew what this meant for a scientist who needed to do delicate manual work. "Miss Crowfoot," the doctor said gently, "this disease will progressively worsen. Your hands will become more painful and deformed over time. I'm sorry, but you should consider finding work that doesn't require fine manual dexterity." Dorothy sat there in stunned silence. She was only in her mid-20s. Her career was just beginning, and now her own body was betraying her. The very hands she needed to conduct her research were becoming her enemy. That night, Dorothy cried. She looked at her swollen, painful hands and wondered if her dream was over. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe insulin was impossible. Maybe she should give up and find easier work. But when morning came, Dorothy made a decision that would define her entire life. She would not quit. The pain might slow her down, but it wouldn't stop her. Those diabetic patients needed someone to keep trying, and she would be that someone. Dorothy developed her own techniques to work despite the pain. When her fingers hurt too much to handle the delicate crystals, she used tools and tweezers. When she couldn't write, she dictated her notes to assistants. On days when the pain was unbearable, she took breaks and then returned to work when she felt better. Her colleagues watched in amazement and concern. They saw her struggle with equipment that others handled easily. They saw her grimace in pain while adjusting the X-ray apparatus. They saw her hands becoming increasingly deformed as the years passed. Many of them privately thought she should rest, take time off, or switch to theoretical work that didn't require manual labor. But Dorothy kept going. Year after year, she collected X-ray photographs of insulin. She filled boxes with photographic plates. She covered notebooks with calculations and observations. The work was slow, painfully slow. Some years she felt like she was making no progress at all. The world around her was changing dramatically. In 1939, World War II began. Many scientists left their research to work on military projects. Laboratories were repurposed for war work. Resources became scarce. Dorothy could have used the war as an excuse to stop her insulin research. Instead, she kept working. Even as bombs fell on British cities, even as friends and colleagues went off to war, Dorothy continued taking X-ray photographs of insulin crystals. Her determination seemed almost superhuman, but Dorothy wasn't just stubbornly clinging to an impossible dream. She was learning. Each photograph taught her something new. Each failed attempt showed her what didn't work. She was developing new mathematical techniques to interpret the X-ray patterns. She was training her mind to see patterns that others couldn't see. People asked her how she could remain so patient. How could she work on the same problem year after year with no guarantee of success? Dorothy's answer was simple but profound. She said, "If you want to discover something important, you have to be willing to fail many times. Every failure teaches you something. And if you're patient enough, eventually all those lessons add up to success." By 1945, Dorothy had been working on insulin for over a decade. Her hands were now severely affected by arthritis. Some of her fingers were permanently bent and swollen. Simple tasks that others took for granted, buttoning a shirt, opening a jar, holding a cup, required significant effort and caused her pain. But Dorothy had also achieved something remarkable. She had collected thousands of high-quality X-ray photographs of insulin. She had developed new mathematical methods for analyzing these photographs. She had trained several students who shared her passion for crystallography. And most importantly, she had proven that she would never give up. Dorothy knew she was still far from solving insulin's structure. The molecule was proving even more complex than anyone had imagined. But she also knew something else. She was closer than anyone had ever been. And she would keep going, one painful day at a time, until she succeeded. Dorothy faced a difficult choice in the mid-1940s. She had already spent more than a decade working on insulin with limited progress. The molecule was proving more complex than anyone had imagined. Every calculation took weeks. Every new X-ray photograph revealed more complications. She could continue working solely on insulin and possibly spend her entire career without solving it, or she could temporarily shift her focus to something else. This decision wasn't just about her career. It was about her contribution to humanity. World War II had just ended, and the world was dealing with its aftermath. Millions of soldiers had been wounded. Disease and infection were killing people across Europe. Hospitals were overwhelmed. Doctors were desperate for better treatments. One molecule stood out as particularly important: penicillin. This antibiotic had been discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928 almost by accident. He noticed that a mold growing in his laboratory killed bacteria. That mold produced penicillin, and it became a miracle drug during the war. It saved countless soldiers from dying of infected wounds, but there was a problem. Nobody knew what penicillin actually looked like at the molecular level. Pharmaceutical companies were producing it, but they were doing so blindly. They didn't understand its structure. This meant they couldn't modify it to make it better. They couldn't create stronger versions or variants that worked against different types of bacteria. Dorothy received a visit from a team of doctors and chemists. They explained the situation to her. They had heard about her work with X-ray crystallography. They knew about her patience and skill. They asked if she could help determine the structure of penicillin. Dorothy looked at her collection of insulin photographs, her years of work, her detailed notebooks. Part of her wanted to say no. She didn't want to abandon insulin. But another part of her understood that penicillin was urgent. Soldiers were dying. Children were dying from simple infections. If she could help solve penicillin's structure, she could save lives immediately. She made her decision. She would work on penicillin, but she wouldn't completely abandon insulin. She would divide her time between both projects. It meant even longer hours and more pain in her deteriorating hands, but Dorothy had never chosen the easy path. Working with penicillin presented new challenges. The molecule was smaller than insulin, but it was still complex. Dorothy obtained pure penicillin crystals and began the familiar process. She positioned the crystals, exposed them to X-rays, developed the photographic plates, and studied the resulting patterns. But this time, something was different. Dorothy had learned so much from her years working on insulin. Her mathematical skills had improved dramatically. Her ability to interpret X-ray patterns had become almost intuitive. She could look at a photograph and see patterns that other scientists missed. The work was still tedious and time-consuming. Dorothy spent entire days in her darkroom developing photographs. The chemical smell was overwhelming. The dim red lights hurt her eyes. Her hands throbbed with constant pain. Some days she had to ask her assistants to help her hold the delicate instruments because her fingers simply wouldn't cooperate. But she kept going. Photograph after photograph, calculation after calculation. She filled notebooks with complex mathematical equations. She made models with wires and balls to visualize how the atoms might be arranged. She worked through weekends and holidays. Her colleagues watched her progress with growing amazement. Dorothy wasn't just working on penicillin. She was revolutionizing the entire field of X-ray crystallography. She developed new mathematical techniques for analyzing complex molecules. She created better methods for interpreting the X-ray patterns. She was essentially inventing new tools as she worked. Then, in 1945, after months of intense work, Dorothy made a breakthrough. She determined the structure of penicillin. She could see exactly how its atoms were arranged. She understood why it worked against bacteria. She had solved a puzzle that many thought impossible. The announcement sent ripples through the scientific community. Pharmaceutical companies immediately used her findings to develop better forms of penicillin. Chemists used her structure to create new antibiotics based on penicillin's design. Doctors had a better understanding of how to use the drug effectively. Lives were saved because of Dorothy's work. Infections that would have been fatal became treatable. Children who would have died lived to grow up. Soldiers recovered from wounds that would have killed them. And Dorothy, working quietly in her Oxford laboratory with her painful, swollen hands, had made it all possible. But Dorothy didn't rest on this achievement. She didn't take a long vacation or slow down. Instead, she immediately turned her attention to another important molecule, vitamin B12. Vitamin B12 was a mystery. Doctors knew that some patients suffered from a terrible disease called pernicious anemia. These patients became weak and pale. Their bodies couldn't produce enough healthy blood cells. Without treatment, they would die. But doctors had discovered that eating liver could cure the disease. Something in liver was helping these patients, and that something was vitamin B12. The problem was that nobody knew what B12 looked like or how it worked. Pharmaceutical companies were extracting it from liver, but the process was expensive and inefficient. If scientists could see B12 structure, they could potentially synthesize it in laboratories, making treatment cheaper and more accessible. Dorothy looked at the available information about B12 and realized something stunning. This molecule was even more complex than penicillin. It had more atoms arranged in a more complicated pattern. Some scientists estimated it would take decades to solve its structure, if it could be solved at all. Once again, Dorothy heard the familiar warnings. It's too complex. You'll waste years trying. Nobody has ever solved anything this complicated. But Dorothy had heard these warnings before, and she had proven them wrong. She began working on B12 with the same patient determination she brought to all her projects. She obtained crystals, took photographs, and started calculations. And all the while, in the background, she continued collecting data on insulin. Her ultimate goal had never changed. Working on 3 major projects simultaneously would have overwhelmed most scientists. But Dorothy had developed a unique working style. She was methodical and organized. She kept detailed records of everything. She trained excellent students who helped with the tedious work. And most importantly, she never rushed. She understood that complex problems required time and patience. Her typical day started early. Despite the pain in her hands, she would carefully prepare her equipment. She supervised her students, teaching them her techniques. She spent hours analyzing photographs and making calculations. She attended faculty meetings and gave lectures. And through it all, she maintained a calm, patient demeanor that inspired everyone around her. People who met Dorothy for the first time were often surprised. They expected a stern, serious scientist consumed by her work. Instead, they found a warm, kind woman who was genuinely interested in other people. She asked about their families. She remembered birthdays. She encouraged young scientists, especially women, to pursue their dreams despite obstacles. But when Dorothy was in her laboratory, her focus was absolute. She would spend hours staring at X-ray photographs, looking for patterns. She would make calculations on paper, checking and rechecking her work. She would build physical models of molecules, trying different arrangements until something clicked. Her work on vitamin B12 progressed slowly but steadily. The molecule was revealing its secrets atom by atom. Dorothy used increasingly sophisticated mathematical techniques. She employed new technologies as they became available. She collaborated with other scientists, sharing information and ideas. By the early 1950s, Dorothy was making significant progress on B12. She could see parts of the structure clearly. Other parts remained mysterious. But she was getting closer. Every photograph provided new information. Every calculation narrowed down the possibilities. Then, in 1954, Dorothy achieved another remarkable breakthrough. She determined the complete structure of vitamin B12. It was the most complex molecule anyone had ever solved using X-ray crystallography. The structure showed an intricate arrangement of atoms, including a cobalt atom at its center, something nobody had expected. This discovery was even more significant than penicillin. The B12 structure was so complex that Dorothy had to use some of the earliest computers to help with the calculations. She was pioneering the use of computers in chemistry. She was showing the world that with patience and new technology, even incredibly difficult problems could be solved. The scientific community was stunned. Dorothy had now solved two of the most important biological molecules known to science. Her patient, methodical approach had succeeded where others had failed. Pharmaceutical companies used her B12 structure to develop synthetic versions of the vitamin, making treatment more affordable for patients with pernicious anemia. Awards and recognition began pouring in. Dorothy was elected to the Royal Society, one of the highest honors in British science. She was only the third woman ever to receive this recognition. Universities invited her to give lectures. Young scientists came from around the world to learn her techniques. But through all this recognition, Dorothy remained focused on her original goal. Insulin was still unsolved. All her work on penicillin and B12 had been valuable. She had saved lives and advanced science. She had developed new techniques and trained new scientists. But insulin remained her ultimate challenge. Dorothy was now in her 40s. Her arthritis had progressively worsened. Her hands were severely deformed. Simple actions caused her significant pain. But she had proven something important to herself and to the world. Patience works. Complex problems can be solved. And sometimes the longest journeys lead to the most important destinations. She returned to her insulin work with renewed energy and better tools. She had decades of experience now. She had new mathematical techniques. She had access to computers. And she had something else. The absolute certainty that if she kept working patiently, eventually she would succeed. The year 1964 started like any other year for Dorothy. She was now 53 years old, still working in her laboratory at Oxford, still taking X-ray photographs of insulin crystals, still making calculations that filled notebook after notebook. Her hands were badly deformed by arthritis, but she had learned to work with them. Some tasks took her longer than they used to, but she never complained. On an ordinary Thursday morning in October, Dorothy was in her laboratory adjusting an X-ray apparatus when her secretary rushed in, breathless and excited. There was an urgent phone call from Sweden. Dorothy wiped her hands on her lab coat and walked to the phone, wondering what could be so urgent. The voice on the other end spoke in formal, accented English. Dorothy listened and slowly her eyes widened. She was being informed that she had won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. The Nobel Prize, the highest honor any scientist could receive. She had won it for her work on penicillin and vitamin B12. Dorothy thanked the caller politely, hung up the phone, and stood there for a moment in silence. Around her, the laboratory suddenly erupted. Her students had overheard the conversation. They were cheering, hugging each other, congratulating her. Someone rushed out to spread the news across the university. But Dorothy's first thought wasn't about the glory or the recognition. She looked down at her deformed hands and thought about all the years of work, all the pain, all the moments of doubt. She thought about the people who had told her to give up, to choose easier problems. She thought about the nights she had cried from frustration and pain. And she thought about all the patients whose lives had been saved because of her work. That evening, reporters crowded outside her home. Cameras flashed. Questions came from every direction. How does it feel to win the Nobel Prize? What will you do with the prize money? Are you the first woman to win in chemistry? Dorothy answered their questions with characteristic modesty. She explained that she wasn't actually the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in chemistry. Marie Curie had won it in 1911, and her daughter Irene Joliot-Curie had won it in 1935. Dorothy was the third woman ever to receive this honor, but the first British woman. One reporter asked her about being a woman in science. "Did you face discrimination?" he asked. "Was it harder for you because you're a woman?" Dorothy thought carefully before answering. She didn't want to sound bitter or angry. "Yes, there were obstacles," she said quietly. "There were people who doubted me. There were doors that were closed to women. But I was fortunate to have supportive teachers and colleagues who judged me by my work, not my gender. And I had a problem that fascinated me so much that I couldn't stop working on it, regardless of what anyone said." Another reporter noticed her hands and asked about her arthritis. "Does it make your work difficult?" Dorothy looked at her swollen, twisted fingers. "It makes things slower," she admitted. "But it hasn't stopped me. When you love what you do, you find ways to keep doing it." The news of Dorothy's Nobel Prize spread around the world. Newspapers ran stories about the British scientist who had solved some of nature's most complex molecular puzzles. Letters of congratulation poured in from colleagues, former students, and people she had never met. Schools invited her to give speeches. Universities offered her honorary degrees, but perhaps the most touching responses came from ordinary people. A mother wrote to thank her because penicillin had saved her son's life after he developed a serious infection. A diabetic patient wrote to express hope that Dorothy's work might someday lead to better insulin treatment. An elderly man wrote to say that vitamin B12 supplements had cured his anemia and given him years of healthy life he wouldn't have had otherwise. Dorothy read every letter carefully. These letters reminded her why she did her work. It wasn't for awards or recognition. It was for these people, for their families, for everyone who suffered from disease and needed better treatments. In December 1964, Dorothy traveled to Stockholm, Sweden for the Nobel Prize ceremony. She wore a simple but elegant dress. Her husband and children accompanied her. The ceremony was grand and formal, held in a magnificent concert hall filled with distinguished guests in formal attire. When Dorothy's name was called, she walked carefully to the stage. Her arthritis made it difficult to navigate the stairs, but she managed with quiet dignity. The King of Sweden presented her with the Nobel Prize medal and diploma. The audience applauded for several minutes. In her acceptance speech, Dorothy didn't just talk about her own achievements. She talked about all the scientists who had contributed to X-ray crystallography. She mentioned her teachers, her colleagues, her students. She emphasized that scientific progress is always a collaborative effort, built on the work of many people over many years. She also talked about the future. "We have made progress in understanding the molecular structures of some important biological substances," she said. "But there is still so much we don't know. There are still diseases we cannot cure, problems we cannot solve. The work must continue." After the ceremony, there were banquets and celebrations. Dorothy met scientists from around the world. She discussed research, shared ideas, and encouraged young researchers. But throughout all the festivities, a part of her mind was still thinking about insulin. When Dorothy returned to Oxford after the Nobel celebrations, many people expected her to relax, to enjoy her fame, perhaps to retire or at least slow down. She was in her 50s, her health was poor, and she had already achieved more than most scientists dream of achieving in a lifetime. Instead, Dorothy went straight back to her laboratory. The very next day after her return, she was examining X-ray photographs of insulin crystals. Her students found her there, bent over her work, just as she had been before winning the Nobel Prize. "Aren't you going to take a break?" one of her students asked. "You've just won the Nobel Prize. You deserve to rest." Dorothy looked up and smiled. "The Nobel Prize is wonderful," she said, "but it doesn't solve insulin. That work is still waiting." Some people didn't understand Dorothy's persistence. She had already proven herself. She had won the highest honor in science. She had nothing left to prove. Why was she still struggling with insulin after 3 decades of work? But Dorothy saw it differently. For her, insulin wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about finishing what she had started. It was about those millions of diabetic patients who needed better treatment. It was about solving one of nature's most beautiful and complex puzzles. The Nobel Prize did bring some practical benefits to her work. With the prize money and her increased fame, Dorothy could secure better funding for her research. She could buy more advanced equipment. She could hire more assistants to help with the tedious work that her arthritic hands could no longer do efficiently. She also used her new platform to advocate for science education and research funding. She gave lectures at schools, encouraging young people, especially girls, to pursue careers in science. She spoke at universities about the importance of basic research, even when practical applications weren't immediately obvious. Dorothy became a mentor to dozens of young scientists. She had a special gift for encouraging people who were struggling or doubting themselves. She would tell them about her own struggles, her own moments of doubt. She would remind them that important discoveries take time and patience. One young female scientist came to Dorothy feeling discouraged. "I've been working on my project for 3 years," she said. "I've made no progress. Maybe I'm not cut out for research." Dorothy looked at her with understanding eyes. 3 years? She said gently. "I've been working on insulin for 30 years. Sometimes the most important problems take the longest to solve. Don't measure your worth by how quickly you succeed. Measure it by how persistently you pursue the truth." Throughout the late 1960s, Dorothy continued her insulin work with renewed focus. The Nobel Prize had validated her approach and her methods. More scientists began to take the insulin problem seriously. Some offered to collaborate with her. Others started their own insulin research projects inspired by her persistence. Dorothy welcomed this increased interest. She shared her data freely. She explained her methods to anyone who asked. She believed that science progressed faster when people worked together and shared information openly. Her laboratory became a hub of activity. Students from different countries came to learn X-ray crystallography from the master herself. Visiting scientists stopped by to discuss their research. The walls were covered with X-ray photographs and molecular diagrams. The air smelled of photographic chemicals and coffee. But despite all this activity and all these years of work, insulin's structure remained stubbornly incomplete. Dorothy could see parts of it. She understood some aspects of how it worked. But the complete, detailed structure still eluded her. The molecule was simply too complex. Every answer led to new questions. Every breakthrough revealed new complications. Some nights, Dorothy would sit alone in her laboratory, looking at her latest insulin photographs. Her hands would throb with pain. Her eyes would be tired from hours of detailed work, and she would wonder if she would ever solve this puzzle. But then she would think about those first blue crystals her mother had shown her as a child. She would remember the wonder she felt then, the desire to understand how nature creates such perfect structures. That wonder had never left her. And as long as she felt that wonder, she knew she would keep working. Dorothy also thought about all the progress she had made. 30 years ago, solving the structure of penicillin had seemed impossible. Then she did it. Solving B12 had seemed even more impossible. Then she did that too. Each impossible problem had eventually yielded to patient, persistent work. So why not insulin? If she kept working, if she kept learning, if she kept trying new approaches, why couldn't she solve this one too? The Nobel Prize had proven that her methods worked. Now she just needed to apply those methods for as long as it took. By 1969, Dorothy had been working on insulin for 35 years. 35 years of taking X-ray photographs. 35 years of mathematical calculations. 35 years of hope mixed with frustration. She was now 58 years old, and her body showed the effects of decades of intense work and chronic arthritis. Her hands were worse than ever. The joints were swollen and bent at unnatural angles. Some mornings she needed help getting dressed. Holding a pen required concentration and caused pain. But Dorothy had long ago stopped letting her physical limitations define what she could accomplish. Something significant had changed in those years, though. Technology was catching up with Dorothy's ambitions. Computers, which had been rare and primitive when she started her work, were becoming more powerful and accessible. These machines could perform thousands of calculations. In minutes, calculations that would have taken human mathematicians months or years to complete. Dorothy recognized that computers might be the key she had been waiting for. The insulin molecule had 777 atoms arranged in a complex three-dimensional structure. To determine exactly where each atom was located, she needed to perform millions of mathematical calculations based on her X-ray photographs. No human could do this work in a reasonable time frame, but a computer could. The problem was that computers in the late 1960s were nothing like the laptops and smartphones we have today. They filled entire rooms. They used punch cards for input. They overheated constantly and broke down frequently. They were expensive to operate, and time on these machines was strictly limited and had to be scheduled weeks in advance. Dorothy had to learn an entirely new skill, computer programming. Here she was, nearly 60 years old, learning to write code and create programs. Many people her age were thinking about retirement. Dorothy was teaching herself a revolutionary new technology. Her younger colleagues and students helped her navigate this new world. They showed her how to prepare punch cards, how to format data for the computer, how to interpret the output. Dorothy absorbed it all with the same patient curiosity she had brought to chemistry decades earlier. She spent months preparing her insulin data for computer analysis. Every X-ray photograph had to be measured precisely. Every reflection had to be recorded. Every intensity had to be noted. This preparatory work was tedious beyond imagination. Dorothy and her team measured thousands upon thousands of data points, recording each one carefully. Then came the moment to feed all this information into the computer. Dorothy carried boxes of punch cards to the university's computer center. Each card had holes punched in specific patterns, representing different pieces of data. If even one card was out of order or incorrectly punched, the entire calculation could fail. The first computer run took hours. The machine hummed and clicked as it processed Dorothy's data. She waited anxiously, hoping everything would work. When the output finally emerged, printed on long sheets of paper, Dorothy's heart sank. There was an error in the program. She would have to start over. This became a familiar pattern. Run the program, find an error, fix it, run it again. Sometimes the computer would crash halfway through a calculation, losing hours of work. Sometimes the results didn't make sense and Dorothy had to figure out what went wrong. Sometimes she discovered errors in her original data and had to go back and remeasure her X-ray photographs. Younger scientists might have given up in frustration. But Dorothy had been patient for 35 years. A few more months of computer troubles weren't going to stop her now. She kept trying, kept learning, kept improving her programs. Her students watched in amazement as this elderly woman with crippled hands mastered computer technology. She would spend entire days at the computer center, checking and rechecking her punch cards, studying the output, making adjustments. When the computer was occupied with other jobs, she would sit nearby, waiting for her turn, using the time to review her data and plan her next steps. Slowly, very slowly, the computer began revealing insulin's secrets. Each successful calculation gave Dorothy a clearer picture of where certain atoms were located. It was like assembling an impossibly complex three-dimensional puzzle, where each piece's position had to be determined mathematically before placing it. Dorothy created physical models using metal rods and colored balls to represent the atoms. As the computer provided more information, she and her team would adjust the model, moving atoms to their correct positions. The model grew more complex and more accurate with each passing week. By the spring of 1969, Dorothy knew she was close. Very close. Most of the insulin molecule's structure was now clear, but there were still gaps, still uncertainties. She needed just a bit more data, a few more calculations to confirm what she suspected. One particular evening in late summer, Dorothy was working late in her laboratory. Most of her colleagues had gone home. The building was quiet except for the hum of equipment. She was studying the latest computer output, comparing it with her physical model, when something clicked in her mind. She saw it. After 35 years, she could finally see the complete structure of insulin. She understood how all 777 atoms were arranged. She could see the molecule's elegant, complex architecture. It was more beautiful and more intricate than she had ever imagined. Dorothy sat there alone in her laboratory, holding the computer printout in her twisted, painful hands, and tears ran down her face. They were tears of relief, of joy, of exhaustion, of triumph. 35 years of work had finally paid off. She wanted to rush out and tell someone, but it was late and the building was empty. So she sat there with her discovery. This secret that nature had guarded for billions of years, and that she had finally uncovered through decades of patient work. The next morning, Dorothy came to the laboratory early. She gathered her research team and explained what she had discovered. She showed them the computer calculations. She demonstrated on the physical model how all the pieces fit together. Her team was stunned. They had believed it would happen eventually, but after so many years, the actual moment of success felt almost unreal. Dorothy spent the following weeks carefully checking every aspect of the structure. She ran the computer calculations again and again, making sure there were no errors. She examined the model from every angle. She compared her results with all her accumulated data from 35 years of experiments. Everything fit perfectly. The structure explained how insulin worked. It showed why the molecule was so effective at helping cells process sugar. It revealed details that would be invaluable for developing better diabetes treatments. When Dorothy was absolutely certain of her results, she prepared to announce her discovery to the scientific world. She wrote a detailed paper describing the insulin structure and her methods. She prepared diagrams and models to help other scientists visualize the molecule. The announcement, when it came, created a sensation in the scientific community. Newspapers around the world carried the story. After 35 years, insulin's structure revealed, the headlines proclaimed. Scientists who had followed Dorothy's work for decades congratulated her. Young researchers who had grown up hearing about the impossible insulin problem were amazed that it had finally been solved. Other scientists immediately recognized the importance of Dorothy's achievement. The insulin structure wasn't just academically interesting. It had practical implications for treating millions of diabetic patients. Pharmaceutical companies could now use the structure to design better forms of insulin. They could modify the molecule to make it work faster or last longer in the body. Medical researchers could study the structure to understand why diabetes occurs when insulin doesn't work properly. Biochemists could use the insulin structure as a template for understanding other similar proteins. Dorothy's discovery opened doors to countless new research projects. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Dorothy's achievement was what it represented about the nature of scientific work. She had shown that some problems cannot be rushed. Some discoveries require decades of patient, persistent effort. She had proven that with enough determination, even the most complex problems could be solved. Dorothy received messages from diabetic patients and their families. They thanked her for work that would improve their lives and the lives of future generations. A mother wrote to say that her diabetic daughter would grow up in a world where insulin was better understood, and that gave her hope. An elderly diabetic man wrote that he had been using insulin for 40 years, and he was grateful that someone had finally figured out exactly how it worked. These messages meant more to Dorothy than any scientific award. They reminded her why she had spent 35 years on this problem. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about helping people who suffered from disease. Dorothy's colleagues asked her how she had maintained her motivation for so many years. How had she kept working when progress was so slow? How had she dealt with the pain, the setbacks, the moments of doubt? Her answer was characteristically humble. "I was fascinated by the problem," she said. "Every small piece of information I discovered made me want to know more. And I kept thinking about the patients who needed better insulin. How could I give up when people were depending on science to help them?" She also credited her team. "I didn't work alone," she emphasized. "I had wonderful students and colleagues who helped with the tedious work, who contributed ideas, who encouraged me when things were difficult. Science is always a collaborative effort." In October 1969, Dorothy stood in a crowded lecture hall and presented the complete insulin structure to her peers. She projected images of the molecule on a screen. She explained the calculations. She described how the atoms were arranged and how the structure related to insulin's function. The audience of scientists listened in absolute silence, absorbing every detail. When Dorothy finished her presentation, the room erupted in applause that lasted several minutes. Scientists stood and cheered. Some had tears in their eyes. They were witnessing history, the solution to one of biology's greatest puzzles. After the presentation, scientists crowded around Dorothy with questions. How had she used the computers? What mathematical techniques had worked best? Could her methods be applied to other complex proteins? Dorothy answered every question patiently, sharing her knowledge freely. That night, alone in her home, Dorothy looked at a photograph of herself from 1934, when she had first decided to work on insulin. She had been so young then, full of energy and ambition, her hands still healthy and strong. Now she was nearly 60, her body worn by years of disease and intensive work. But she had done it. She had solved insulin, and in doing so, she had proven something important about human determination and patience. Some goals are worth pursuing for decades. Some problems require a lifetime of work. And sometimes, just sometimes, persistence and patience triumph over every obstacle. After Dorothy published the complete insulin structure in 1969, she expected life to return to normal. She thought she would simply continue her research, perhaps on other molecules, and enjoy the quiet satisfaction of having solved a problem that had consumed 35 years of her life. But that's not what happened at all. The world of medicine was transformed by her discovery. Within months, pharmaceutical companies around the globe were studying Dorothy's insulin structure. Scientists were examining every detail of how the 777 atoms were arranged. They were trying to understand exactly why insulin worked the way it did. Before Dorothy's discovery, producing insulin was a difficult and imperfect process. Companies extracted insulin from the pancreases of cows and pigs. This animal insulin worked reasonably well in humans, but it wasn't perfect. Some patients had allergic reactions to it. The insulin didn't always act consistently in the body, and the supply was limited by how many animals could be processed. But now, with Dorothy's structure in hand, scientists could see exactly how insulin was built. They could understand which parts of the molecule were essential for its function, and which parts could potentially be modified. This knowledge opened up possibilities that had been pure fantasy just a few years earlier. Pharmaceutical researchers began designing modified versions of insulin. They used Dorothy's structure as a blueprint. If they wanted insulin to work faster, they could identify which atoms to change. If they wanted it to last longer in the bloodstream, they could see where to make modifications. Dorothy's 35 years of patient work were now enabling rapid innovation. By the mid-1970s, the first synthetic human insulin was being developed. Instead of extracting it from animals, scientists could now manufacture insulin that was identical to what the human body naturally produces. This was revolutionary. Patients no longer had to worry about allergic reactions to animal proteins. The insulin was more consistent and more effective. Dorothy watched these developments with quiet pride. She received regular updates from pharmaceutical companies and medical researchers who were using her work. They would write to tell her about new insulin variants they had created. They would explain how her structure had guided their research. They would thank her for making their work possible. But the letters that touched Dorothy most deeply came from ordinary people. A teenage girl wrote to explain that the new synthetic insulin had changed her life. She no longer had severe reactions to her medication. She could go to school and play sports like other children. She could dream about her future instead of worrying constantly about her disease. An elderly man wrote that he had been diabetic for 30 years. The new insulin worked better than anything he had tried before. His blood sugar was more stable. He felt healthier. He wanted Dorothy to know that her decades of work had given him a better quality of life in his final years. A mother sent a photograph of her 5-year-old diabetic son. The little boy was smiling, holding his insulin pen. The mother explained that her son would grow up in a world with increasingly better insulin treatments, all thanks to Dorothy's discovery. She wanted Dorothy to see the face of one child whose future was brighter because of her work. Dorothy kept these letters in a special box. When she felt tired or when her arthritis pain was particularly bad, she would read through them. They reminded her why she had persevered for so many years. Science wasn't just about understanding molecules, it was about improving human lives. Throughout the 1970s, Dorothy's fame continued to grow. She received honorary degrees from universities around the world. Scientific societies awarded her medals and prizes. Governments recognized her contributions to medicine and science. She was appointed to the Order of Merit, one of the highest honors in the United Kingdom, given to only 24 living people at any time. But Dorothy remained remarkably humble through all this recognition. When reporters asked her about her achievements, she always emphasized the contributions of her colleagues and students. When she gave speeches, she talked about the importance of basic research and patient, careful work. She never boasted or claimed sole credit for discoveries that had involved many people over many years. Dorothy also became increasingly interested in using her platform to address larger issues. She had spent her career focused on molecules and structures, but now she began thinking about humanity's bigger challenges. She was particularly concerned about two things: science education and world peace. Dorothy had experienced firsthand how difficult it was for women and people from modest backgrounds to enter science. She had faced discrimination and doubt throughout her career. She didn't want future generations to struggle the way she had. So she began speaking at schools, particularly girls' schools, encouraging young people to pursue science. Her message was simple but powerful. Science isn't just for geniuses, she would tell students. It's for anyone who is curious and willing to work hard. It's for anyone who wants to understand how the world works and help solve problems. Your gender, your background, where you come from, none of that matters as much as your curiosity and determination. Young women, especially, found Dorothy's story inspiring. Here was a woman who had succeeded in a male-dominated field. She had overcome physical disability, discrimination, and decades of failure before finally achieving her goal. If Dorothy could do it, maybe they could too. Dorothy also became increasingly involved in peace activism. She had lived through 2 world wars. She had seen how conflict disrupted scientific progress and caused immense human suffering. She believed that scientists had a special responsibility to promote international cooperation and understanding. She joined organizations that promoted scientific exchange between countries, even countries that were political enemies. During the Cold War, when the United States and Soviet Union were bitter rivals, Dorothy worked to maintain communication between scientists on both sides. She believed that science transcended politics and that scientists should work together regardless of their government's relationships. Some people criticized Dorothy for this stance. They thought she was being naive or even unpatriotic. But Dorothy had a different view. Scientists are trying to understand truth, she would say. Truth doesn't have a nationality. A molecule works the same way whether it's studied in London, Moscow, or Washington. We should be sharing knowledge, not keeping secrets. Dorothy traveled extensively during the 1970s and 1980s, despite her worsening health. Her arthritis made travel painful and difficult. Long flights hurt her joints. Walking through airports exhausted her. But she kept going because she believed the message she was spreading was important. In China, she lectured to enthusiastic students who were rebuilding their scientific institutions after years of political turmoil. In India, she met with young crystallographers who were following in her footsteps. In Africa, she visited laboratories that were studying tropical diseases. Everywhere she went, Dorothy encouraged local scientists, shared her expertise, and advocated for increased investment in research. Back in Oxford, Dorothy continued mentoring students. Her laboratory remained active throughout the 1970s and 1980s. She supervised doctoral students, discussed research problems, and maintained her own smaller projects. She no longer worked the exhausting hours of her younger years, but her mind remained sharp and curious. Her students from this period remember her not just as a brilliant scientist, but as a kind and patient teacher. She would spend hours explaining complex concepts to struggling students. She never made anyone feel stupid for asking questions. She shared her failures as openly as her successes, helping young scientists understand that setbacks were a normal part of research. One of her students later recalled, "Dorothy taught me that being a scientist isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being curious, persistent, and willing to learn from failure. She showed me that you could be world famous and still be humble. She proved that you could do groundbreaking research and still be a kind, decent human being." By the early 1980s, the impact of Dorothy's insulin work was becoming even clearer. The biotechnology revolution was beginning. Companies were using genetic engineering to produce human insulin in bacteria. This made insulin production cheaper and more efficient. Millions more diabetic patients around the world could now afford treatment. Medical researchers had moved beyond just copying natural insulin. They were designing entirely new insulin variants with properties that didn't exist in nature. Some versions worked within minutes of injection. Others provided steady insulin levels for 24 hours. All of this innovation was built on the foundation of Dorothy's structure. Dorothy attended medical conferences where doctors presented studies showing improved outcomes for diabetic patients. She heard about people living longer, healthier lives. She learned about children with diabetes who could now expect to grow up, have careers, start families, and live full lives. Each story represented the real-world impact of her 35 years of patient work. In 1984, Dorothy was 73 years old. Her body was worn by decades of arthritis. Walking was difficult. Her hands were so deformed that she could no longer do laboratory work herself. But her mind was still active, still curious, still engaged with the world of science. She gave a lecture that year reflecting on her career. "When I started working on insulin in 1934, she told the audience, I just wanted to understand how this important molecule was built. I didn't imagine that it would take 35 years. I didn't know that my work would lead to better treatments for millions of people. I just knew that the problem was fascinating and important, and that someone needed to solve it." She paused and looked out at the young scientists in the audience. "That's what I hope you'll remember," she continued. "Don't choose your research based on what's easy or what will bring quick fame. Choose problems that matter. Choose questions that fascinate you. And then be patient. Some of the most important discoveries take decades of work. But if you persist, if you maintain your curiosity and dedication, you can achieve things you never imagined possible." The audience gave her a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Many had tears in their eyes. They were listening to a living legend, a woman who had changed medicine through sheer determination and patience. And her message was clear. Great achievements come not from brilliance alone, but from curiosity, persistence, and the courage to tackle difficult problems even when success seems impossibly distant. As Dorothy entered her 70s and 80s, her body continued to betray her. The arthritis that had plagued her for 5 decades had progressed to the point where even simple daily tasks required assistance. Her fingers were bent and twisted into positions that looked painful just to see. Some days, she needed help eating her meals or getting dressed, but those who knew Dorothy well noticed something remarkable. Despite her physical deterioration, her spirit never weakened. Her eyes still sparkled with curiosity when discussing science. Her mind remained sharp and engaged. She continued reading scientific journals, staying updated on the latest discoveries in crystallography and molecular biology. Dorothy's home became a gathering place for scientists from around the world. Young researchers would visit to seek her advice. Established scientists would stop by to discuss their work. She received them all warmly, often serving tea with her twisted hands, asking questions, offering insights, sharing stories from her decades of research. One young crystallographer visited her in the late 1980s, discouraged because his research project wasn't progressing. He had been working on a difficult protein structure for 3 years with little success. He was thinking about quitting research entirely. Dorothy listened patiently to his frustrations. Then she smiled and said, 3 years feels like a long time when you're living through it. But in the grand scheme of science, 3 years is nothing. I worked on insulin for 35 years. There were stretches where I made no visible progress for years at a time. The question isn't whether you're succeeding quickly. The question is whether the problem is worth solving. If it is, then keep working. The young scientist left that meeting with renewed determination. Years later, he successfully solved his protein structure and credited Dorothy's encouragement as the reason he didn't give up. This was just one of countless similar stories. Dorothy's influence extended far beyond her own discoveries. She inspired generations of scientists to persist through difficulties. Throughout the 1980s and early 1990s, the diabetes treatment revolution that Dorothy had enabled continued accelerating. Biotechnology companies were producing new forms of insulin regularly. Some worked in 5 minutes. Others lasted for days in the body. Some could be inhaled instead of injected. Each innovation made life easier for diabetic patients. Medical researchers were also making breakthroughs in understanding diabetes itself. Why did some people develop the disease? How did genetics play a role? Could diabetes be prevented or even cured? All of this research built on the foundation of understanding insulin's structure, the structure Dorothy had spent 35 years determining. By the early 1990s, more than 100 million people worldwide were living with diabetes. Without insulin treatment, most of them would have died. But because of insulin therapy that was continuously improving thanks to Dorothy's work, they could live relatively normal lives. They could work, raise families, pursue their dreams. Dorothy received letters throughout her later years from people whose lives had been saved by insulin. A woman wrote that she had been diagnosed with diabetes as a child in the 1950s. Doctors told her parents she probably wouldn't live to adulthood. But she had survived, using increasingly better forms of insulin. Now she was a grandmother. And she wanted Dorothy to know that she owed her entire adult life to scientific progress that Dorothy had made possible. A man wrote that his daughter was diagnosed with diabetes at age 7. He was devastated, fearing his daughter would never have a normal childhood. But modern insulin treatments allowed her to participate in sports, excel in school, and live without constant medical crises. He enclosed a photo of his daughter at her high school graduation, smiling and healthy. These letters meant everything to Dorothy. They reminded her that science wasn't abstract or theoretical. It was deeply human. Every molecule she had studied represented real people with real lives. Every hour she had spent in the laboratory, every calculation she had made, every moment of pain she had worked through, all of it had been for these people. In 1993, Dorothy's health began declining more rapidly. She was 82 years old, and her body was simply wearing out. She spent more time resting, less time receiving visitors, but she remained mentally alert and continued following scientific developments with interest. One afternoon, a former student visited and brought news about a new development in insulin research. Scientists were working on an artificial pancreas, a device that would automatically monitor blood sugar and deliver the right amount of insulin without requiring multiple daily injections. This breakthrough was only possible because scientists understood insulin's structure and how it worked in the body. Dorothy listened with tears in her eyes. "That's wonderful," she whispered. "That will change so many lives." Even in her final years, she was thinking about the patients, about the people who would benefit from scientific progress. Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgkin passed away on July 29, 1994. She was 84 years old. News of her death spread quickly through the scientific community. Obituaries appeared in newspapers around the world. They described her as one of the 20th century's greatest scientists, a pioneer who had revolutionized our understanding of molecular biology. But Dorothy would have been more pleased by the other tributes that appeared. Diabetes organizations issued statements thanking her for her contributions to their patients' lives. Medical journals published articles explaining how her insulin work had transformed diabetes treatment. Patient advocacy groups organized memorials to honor the woman whose research had saved countless lives. At her memorial service in Oxford, scientists, former students, and family members gathered to remember Dorothy. They shared stories about her patience, her kindness, her determination, her brilliant mind, and her humble spirit. Many mentioned that Dorothy never seemed to realize how extraordinary she was. She always acted as though her achievements were simply what any dedicated scientist would accomplish. One speaker read from a letter Dorothy had written years earlier to a discouraged young researcher. "Don't measure success by awards or recognition," Dorothy had written. "Measure it by whether you're asking important questions and genuinely trying to answer them. Measure it by whether your work might someday help someone. That's what really matters." After Dorothy's death, her legacy only grew stronger. The field of structural biology, using X-ray crystallography and other techniques to determine molecular structures, exploded. Scientists applied Dorothy's methods to thousands of important molecules. New drugs were designed based on structural information. Medical treatments improved dramatically. The techniques Dorothy had pioneered became standard tools in pharmaceutical research. Today, when companies develop new medicines, one of the first steps is determining the molecular structure of their drug target. This approach, understanding structure to guide treatment, came directly from Dorothy's work. Insulin treatment continued advancing after Dorothy's death. By the early 2000s, scientists had developed insulin analogs that worked even better than natural human insulin. Some diabetic patients could now control their disease with just 1 or 2 injections per day instead of 5 or 6. The artificial pancreas that Dorothy heard about shortly before her death became a reality in the 2010s, giving patients even more freedom. In the decades since Dorothy's death, diabetes research has progressed in ways she could hardly have imagined. Scientists are working on insulin pills that don't require injections at all. Researchers are studying ways to regenerate the pancreatic cells that produce insulin naturally. Some patients have even been cured of their diabetes through innovative treatments. All of this progress stands on the foundation Dorothy built. Her 35 years of patient work on insulin structure opened doors that led to breakthrough after breakthrough. She couldn't have predicted exactly how her work would be used, but she knew that understanding fundamental structures was essential for medical progress. Today, Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgkin is remembered not just for her scientific achievements, but for what her life represented. She showed that some of the most important work requires decades of patience. She proved that physical disability doesn't have to limit intellectual achievement. She demonstrated that women could excel in fields that had traditionally excluded them. Universities around the world have named scholarships, laboratories, and awards after Dorothy. Young scientists, especially young women, study her life for inspiration. When they face obstacles or discrimination, they remember Dorothy working through decades of pain and doubt to achieve her goals. When they feel discouraged by slow progress, they remember Dorothy's 35-year journey to solve insulin. The Dorothy Hodgkin Fellowship Program in the United Kingdom supports female scientists in the early stages of their careers, helping them overcome the barriers that Dorothy faced. Thousands of women have benefited from these fellowships, pursuing their own scientific dreams, because Dorothy's legacy made their path a little easier. Perhaps most importantly, Dorothy's story teaches us something profound about the nature of valuable work. We live in a world that often demands immediate results, quick success, instant gratification. Dorothy's life reminds us that some things worth doing take time. Real breakthroughs sometimes require decades of patient, persistent effort. Dorothy once said, "I was captured for life by chemistry and by crystals." That passion, that fascination with understanding how nature works at its most fundamental level, sustained her through 35 years of working on a single problem. It carried her through pain, doubt, and countless setbacks. And ultimately, it led to discoveries that have saved millions of lives and continue benefiting humanity today. When Dorothy started her work on insulin in 1934, she was a young woman with a dream and a question. When she finally solved insulin's structure in 1969, she was a grandmother whose hands barely worked. But she had her answer, and that answer changed the world. Today, somewhere in the world, a diabetic child wakes up and takes their insulin injection without thinking much about it. They go to school, play with friends, dream about their future. They probably don't know Dorothy Crowfoot Hodgkin's name. They don't know about the 35 years of patient work that made their treatment possible. But they're alive and healthy because of her. And that, more than any award or recognition, is Dorothy's true legacy. She clarified biochemistry patiently, one difficult molecule at a time. And in doing so, she helped millions of people live better, longer, healthier lives. Her story reminds us that patience is powerful, that dedication matters, that one person, working steadily toward a goal for decades, can change the world, and that the most valuable discoveries often come from asking important questions and refusing to give up until we find the answers, no matter how long it takes.